Um, Today we are doing what I call basic question design, and we're going to go over the various uh, things that you can do with really just creating questions. There's a whole bunch of things you can do once they're created, and once you start really filling at, developing your survey. The first thing I want to tell you is you really and truly need to plan your survey. Uh, Careful planning is essential to having a properly constructed survey and will end up saving you a lot of time in the long run, especially if you're doing something a little more advanced, a little more complicated than just a few questions. Really sitting down and thinking about how you want to design your entire survey, how you want your respondents to flow through it, will really help you. Really and truly, don't just sit down in front of Qualtrics and start typing.
No.
And figure it out. Think you'll figure it out as you go along. I've seen a lot of people really have to almost redo a lot of work because of that. I usually recommend writing all your questions in a word processor like Microsoft Word or Google Docs or whatever you like to use. It has better grammar and spelling checks than Qualtrics does. You can rearrange things a little more easily to start with. And if you do that, be sure to include notes about your, any kind of skip logic or display logic, validation kinds of things, just as notes to yourself as you move into Qualtrics. Now you can always copy and paste from Word or Google Docs into Qualtrics. Unfortunately, there's no way to import it directly from either of those. But I think it will in the long run. It sounds like extra work and extra steps. I think in the long run, it will really help save you a lot of time and keep things in order. So, and also, as we looked at briefly last week, when you first come into Qualtrics and you say you want to create a new survey, you can import things that you've already created or some of the default things that Qualtrics provides. 9 times out of 10, probably, you're going to start from scratch. And when you do start from scratch, this is basically what you're going to come into and see. And we saw this last week as well. And it will always start you off with the default question block and one question, one multiple choice question. Most of the time, you're going to want to start with a descriptive question, and that's going to be your consent form, explaining what you're doing and getting consent from your respondents, and then the one question, or maybe two, one asking if they're 18 or over, and then the second one asking if they consent to completing the survey. So you start off in here and you can change what type of question it is just by coming over here to question type. And if you hover over, it kind of gives you a little preview of what that looks like. And so there's text graphic, matrix tables, which are not accessible. Sliders are not either. Form field, we'll take a look at these in a minute. It's really just setting up a bunch of short text things. You can do rank order, side by side things. Net promoter score, that's if you're doing some marketing research, as it says, customer loyalty metric. That's a Qualtrics thing. You can time how long somebody spends on a particular page. So if you're having them read some kind of an essay, you can time how long they actually spend reading that essay. Graphic slider. Basically anything that's graphic is not accessible. Constant sum. This is if you say you're asking somebody how much time they spend on various tasks, and it all has to add up to, say, 100, as in 100%. You can have them upload files, pick, group, and rank. Hello, I'm sorry, did somebody have a question?
You hold on the shift and then you do the winkies, the semicolon, and then you do the parenthesis. I know it didn't come to me what the semicolon is.
Drill down is kind of a, here we go. It's kind of a new, one of the newer question types. And it's, you know, the classic example for this is the year, make, and model of a car. We're not going to go through this. There are instructions that Qualtrics has. Basically, you have to put all your choices into a Excel spreadsheet and then upload that. But this can be very useful. You can have somebody sign in there, a heat map. You've seen these where there's a picture or a graphic of something, and people can select different spots on that. A hotspot is very similar. You can get information, as it says, about your respondents, such as what operating system they're using. This isn't an actual question that they answer. It's gathered, I guess, behind the scenes. There's captcha verification. You all know what that is. You've seen that before. And people can highlight things in, say, an essay that you have them read. For some reason, screen capture we do not have access to the screen capture. But I don't know many instances where that would be all that useful. Once you have selected your question type, what various options you have over here are going to change based on that question type. So, here we have 3 radio buttons. You can have one or turn it into a checkbox. You can add, and you can even just type it in as well. I think I mentioned last week, edit multiple. If you have a big long list, you can copy and paste that list into here, and then it will automatically change all of these. We're going to look through these in a moment. And they also have, as it says, use suggested choices. And so it can go disagree and true, false, below, regretful, delightful, change the order back and forth. Format, select box. Select boxes, I don't believe are accessible. I'd have to double check that. So all kinds of neat things that you can play with and go back and forth. Response requirements, as you can add requirements. Force response means they won't be able to continue the survey unless they answer that question. They must answer it. Request response is basically, pretty please answer it. That it might bring them back to that question again and say, please answer this. Validation, minimum number of choices selected. So maybe they have to select at least one, or, if it's one of these, you have 10 choices and you want them to pick 3. You can make them pick 3. If they don't pick 3, then it will come back and say you need to pick more. Or, a range in between. And then custom validation. We're going to get into this more, I believe, next week. And you'll see this kind of a dialogue whenever there's some kind of logic to be used. So here, write the, click to write the question. And then if poor is selected, then you'll have to give it a error message. There's display logic as to whether or not this will be displayed, again, based on that same kind of logic type question. I think we go through this more next week as well. Skip logic is, if they answer terrible, then skip to question 20, etc. You've all seen those. Carry forward choices can be quite useful. If this were, say, a list of 10 ice cream flavors, you could say, please pick your favorite 3. And then you would carry forward your choices to the next question, where it might ask specifically about the 3 that they chose. You can randomize the order of the choices. Sometimes that's necessary, especially if you have a lot. Some people tend to pick from the beginning of a long list because they just don't want to read through the whole thing. Unicode values we're going to look at in just a minute. And default choices, if you want a default choice for everybody, you just pick it, and then so we'll say terrible and click save. And now it's always done as the default. Undo that for the moment. Any questions so far? Okay. I think I mentioned last week, all of your questions go in blocks, and you can have as many blocks as you want and as many questions as you want in each block. And I highly recommend naming these. It just makes it a lot easier to keep everything in order. You know what's going on in each one. So we can call this consent. And I'm going to change it right now to text entry. I'm going to add another question. Well, let's add another question above this. And this one is going to be text graphic. You can also, I think I mentioned this last week. Sometimes Qualtrics will call this the export tag, because when you export your data, this will become the variable name if you're using SPSS, or the column header if you're using Excel. So it's either a variable name, a export tag. It calls it a couple of different things depending on where you are. But I really recommend doing this, because then when you download your data, you're not going to have just Q1, Q2, Q3. These variable names will make a lot more sense. You click on here, now you can really write whatever you want. Of course, as a rich content editor, you've seen these in various web forms. You can get all the nice formatting. You can insert graphics, change the font, do bold, italics, etc. And so and change this. What I'm going to do is here, multiple choice. And so that, would be your consent block. Of course, you would have much better text in here for doing that. And so the consent block, and then you can add another block. Again, you can add a question. You can do text entry, say, okay, so I think you get the idea. A little thing up here is this pipe text. I think I mentioned it last week, is where you can take information from previous questions, answers. Embedded data field is something that you do in this survey flow. We'll be doing that in a couple of weeks, but it's basically variables and information that you set behind the scenes. let's say you're doing body mass index. You can ask your respondents what their height and weight are, and then behind the scenes do the math to actually create that, calculate their BMI, and then use embedded data fields to display it back to them. IP location, survey links. As I say, we'll be going through this much more in the coming weeks. But the current date and time, I'm just gonna you see it puts in this funny looking placeholder. And you don't want to edit that. If you want the current date and time in, you absolutely have to leave it as it is. Just take a quick look at the preview. See, we have one block, then the next block, and today's current date. Can you see this? Sometimes when I switch tabs, stuff starts to disappear.
Yes, we can see it.
Great, wonderful. This, as you saw, I clicked on the preview button to see this. This share preview is so that you can share the preview of your survey with other people. Just copy this link and send it to them. Brand internal only means for us, Syracuse University only. And public means anybody who has the link. You don't have to worry too much because these links can be, it's not really something that somebody can guess. As you see, you can have what it will look like on somebody's phone. You can turn that on and off up here. Restart the survey is exactly that. You're just restarting it. Place bookmark is useful if you have a fairly long survey. You really want to preview and test things as you go along. Don't do the entire survey and then test it. Test it as you go along. But that can be tedious. As you get along, you have to go through the whole beginning. You can place a bookmark, and that will, when you do the next preview, you can bring yourself right to that bookmark and skip all the stuff that you've already determined is working the way you want it to. Under tools, shows hidden questions. Ignore validation can be useful, so that you can just click through things and not have to make sure that you're answering it exactly properly every time. If you just want to go through and see the flow of the survey. View published version is as you keep working on your survey, Qualtrics automatically saves things. But then every so often, depending on what changes you make, especially if you're working in the survey flow, you need to publish your survey to incorporate all of those changes. And so what this will do is just bring you back to whatever the most recent published version is. And we can close that up. And if you look over here, right now it's in normal view. If you do HTML view, you see all the HTML codes that might be in there. And sometimes you'll want to see that, especially if you're doing some different formatting of things that might be necessary. Most of the time you'll be in normal view. I mentioned you can change these question numbers or export tags or variable names. They go by all three questions. If you're using a published survey, that especially if it comes with code like SPSS code to analyze it, you want to make sure that you use all the same variable names that they do. That will make your life infinitely easier once you've collected all your data and then download it. You can then just make a couple of changes about where your file is and the file name, and then everything that they give you should run. Whereas if you just stay with the Q1, Q2, etc., that's you're going to either have to change all the variable names in SPSS or change the code, which I absolutely recommend you do not do. Don't mess with any code that you don't have to. I think we looked at auto renumber questions briefly. If you do, for some reason, need to keep it as Q1 and Q2, or perhaps you want to use a different prefix, maybe your code comes and it's Q, but it's let's say IT, and you can see how it changes here. And you can still do Q1, Q, however, and change some of them. If you click this, then any ones that you've already changed, it will skip. It won't change it to IT or Q or whatever else you want to use. As you'll perhaps notice, as you create new questions, I'm just going to do a couple here so you can see. It automatically calls it Q5, Q6, but I can move this. And as you see, it doesn't change the numbering. So if you want to keep the Q5, Q6, but then move things around and then get them back in order, you can come back here and click sequential numbering. And now it's renumbered them in succession. And you'll also notice that this isn't Q1 because there are already 3 questions before that. This is the 4th question, and this one is the 6th question. Now, with each of these individual responses, you have some options as well. One, it says dislike a great deal. You can change it to whatever you like. You can use a rich content editor to do that. You can put a graphic in. Exclude from analysis. I don't really recommend you do this, because what this is when you're doing charts and graphs in Qualtrics, Qualtrics won't include that particular answer in creating any of your charts, analyses, tables, etc. And I don't normally recommend excluding things like that. You can put in piped text, which we spoke about already. Add display logic. We're going to do that next week. You can create groups. So let's say you have a whole list of all 50 states and you want to group them by region. You can create those groups and put all of your states in those groups. It's nothing more than a visual, I guess, cue for your respondent. It will not affect how the answers are collected. It will not affect how they are analyzed if you're doing them, doing the charts and things in Qualtrics itself. You can move it up, move it down, can remove it altogether. And you can also do allow text entry so that people can write in, this is good if this is going to be, say, other. And usually that would be your last choice. Now, something else that is very useful, and unless you were playing around and just clicked on this, you would never know you could do it. When you create a question that has various options like this, whether this is a checkbox or anything else, Qualtrics automatically numbers them 1 through however many you have. When you download your data, that's how it's going to be, as we say, coded. 1 will be other, 2 will be disliked somewhat, etc. Sometimes you might want to redo that. You want it in a different order. So you can then say 5, 4, keep 3, 2, and 1. So if, again, for whatever reason, you want different codes for these labels, and in your data, especially if you're using a published survey and they say you have to flip the scales, this is one easy way of doing that. The other thing here that they call variable naming is kind of a misnomer, because it's not naming the variable as we tend to think of it, as like the column header in Excel, or a variable name in SPSS or Stata or something else. It's actually what most programs will call the value label. And say other stuff. Now, when you download, especially to SPSS, your data will have 4 other, your respondents still see on the survey what's over here. Behind the scenes, your data will be 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And especially if you're bringing it into SPSS, when you do a table or chart in SPSS, all the 5s will be labeled other stuff, not just plain other, but other stuff. And dislike kinda rather than dislike someone. Sometimes by default, these the default labels can be very long. And so this is a way of making your output look a little bit nicer. You don't have these big long sentences. You have a, just a quick label to it. And when you come over here, it'll say this question has recoded values. This question has variable naming, which is all the stuff that we just did. Let's see, I'm just going through my notes here. Okay, I think we've gotten through just about everything. Just want to reiterate that technically, according to accessibility rules, all of you should be showing the question numbers to your respondents. The thing is, by default, Qualtrics does not do that. You can come over here to survey options. I'm going to turn it on just so you can see. And let's see, well, I need to publish that. Okay, you see now it says it has that consent YN and consent text. And city-born Q4, and of course Q6, that's what accessibility says you should have. But of course, if you've changed some of them, that's not going to make sense, hearing that on a screen reader. Also, of course, if you do any kind of question randomization, Qualtrics will not renumber the questions on the fly for each respondent. So some will see Q4, Q6, some will see Q7, Q3. So it's kind of a little bit of a sticky situation, and something you'll just need to really decide for yourself and have a good reason for doing it that way. That's the most I can tell you right now. So until Qualtrics figures out a way that it can renumber the questions on the fly, it's going to be something you need to choose and decide for yourself. Okay, I think we've gotten through everything. Are there any questions?
How do you hide the variable name in
Qualtrics? By default, if you come into survey options and under general options, down here, it says show respondents question numbers. By default, that is off. I just turned it on just now, just so you could see what happens when it's turned on, because of course, accessibility rules say that it should be turned on, but there are good reasons why sometimes you don't want to do that.
Right, thank you.
Anything else? Okay, couple of things about next week. First of all, due to situation beyond my control, I'm going to have to do the workshop on Tuesday instead of Tuesday, October 18, instead of the 17th. Very sorry about the short notice and the change, but it's just not something I was able to get out of. You do not need to re-register if you've already registered for it, and I will certainly send out a reminder. Probably at this point do that tomorrow, because there were a few people who registered who aren't here today. And so, as I say, everything is recorded, so if you can't make it on Tuesday, you won't miss anything. And next week, we will be doing intermediate question design. We'll be going into the validation in a bit more depth, and some other neat things. Any other questions? Okay, then, if you do have questions during the week, you know how to contact me, and I will see you next Tuesday. All right, thank you, everyone.